March 1994. The Chihuahua Desert stretched endlessly, a barren sea of ochre sand and thorned shrubs shimmering beneath a ruthless Mexican sun. In the distance, heat waves bent the horizon, mirages dancing like phantom lakes. For most, this was no place for romance. But for Ethan Morrison and Alice Patterson, it was the beginning of a long-awaited celebration. Ethan was 54 years old, a retired engineer from Phoenix, with a tall frame and weathered hands that spoke of years spent drafting, building, and fixing. Beside him walked Alice, 46, an art teacher who carried the quiet grace of someone who had waited too long for a dream to finally come true. That dream was alive within her. She was pregnant after years of struggle, treatments, and heartbreak. Against the odds, Alice was going to be a mother. The couple had planned the trip carefully. They left Tucson early on the morning of March 15, driving south in a rented Ford Explorer. Their destination, a rustic adobe hotel in a small town near the desert's edge. It wasn't just a vacation, it was a pilgrimage of joy, a symbolic journey to mark the start of a new chapter in their lives. At 2:30 p.m., as they stood on a dusty roadside, Ethan pulled out his cell phone, clunky by today's standards, barely capable of holding a signal in remote stretches. He called his brother Marcus in Phoenix. His voice was light, almost boyish as he described the scenery. Endless skies, golden dunes, Alice smiling as she traced the ridges of a cactus flower into her sketch pad. "They're safe," Marcus would later recall telling his wife after he hung up. He sounded happy. But moments later, when Marcus tried to call back to share some family news, the phone gave only silence. No signal, no response. It was the last time anyone would hear from Ethan Morrison or Alice Patterson. By nightfall, they had not arrived at their hotel. The innkeeper, an elderly woman named Rosa, assumed they had changed plans. She watched for them at breakfast, then at dinner. But no one came. Back in Phoenix, Marcus grew uneasy when Ethan failed to call again. Ethan was meticulous, a man of routine who always checked in. By the following morning, unease turned to dread. Marcus contacted the Tucson police, reporting the couple missing. The authorities acted quickly. The case involved American citizens, and their last known route suggested they had crossed into Mexico. Tucson police reached out to Chihuahua state officials. Within hours, a joint alert went out. Helicopters scanned the desert from above, their rotors chopping the heavy air. Jeeps and pickup trucks crawled along dirt roads, kicking up plumes of dust. Volunteers from nearby villages joined in, calling the couple's names into the wind-bent silence. 3 days later, searchers found the Explorer. It sat abandoned on a forgotten dirt track about 50 miles south of Puerto Palomas. The keys dangled in the ignition. The doors were unlocked. Inside lay their belongings: Ethan's wallet with cash untouched, Alice's sketchbook filled with drawings of desert blooms, and a small ultrasound photo taped to the first page, a tiny black and white promise of life. A picnic of cheese and fruit still sat in a plastic container, half-eaten, as if they had been interrupted mid-meal. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks leading away, only the vast, pitiless desert stretching in every direction.
Authorities interviewed locals. No one had seen anything unusual. No strangers lurking, no vehicles racing away. Rosa, the innkeeper, remembered the couple with unusual clarity. Alice glowing in her pink blouse, hand resting protectively over her stomach. Ethan laughing about how the baby would be born with a taste for salsa. They had checked in, dropped their bags, and mentioned they would take a short hike to view nearby petroglyphs. After that, they were gone. For Alice's family, the shock was unbearable. Her sister Laura wept over the phone to detectives, explaining how Alice had spent years praying for this child. "She wanted to name her Lily," Laura whispered, "after our mother. She said it was her miracle." Marcus Morrison, however, refused to despair. He plastered flyers across the Southwest, his brother's face staring out from gas stations, grocery stores, and local news bulletins. He appeared on regional TV, his voice trembling but resolute. My brother wouldn't just walk away. Alice wouldn't vanish, not now, not with the baby. Someone knows what happened. Please, help us find them. But weeks turned to months. Leads evaporated. Tips went nowhere. The desert revealed nothing. The official investigation slowed, then stalled. Files collected dust in a government office in Chihuahua City, while families on both sides of the border clung to fading hope. And in Albuquerque, Laura set a single candle in her window every night, praying it might guide Alice home. The Chihuahua Desert is vast, 175,000 square miles of scrubland, rock, and shifting sands. It is a land that swallows secrets whole. In March of 1994, it claimed 2 more. For the families, grief hardened into silence. For the authorities, the trail went cold. And for 13 long years, no one would know what really happened to Ethan Morrison and Alice Patterson.
The Chihuahuan Desert does not forgive. It is a land of extremes, blistering heat by day, bone-cutting cold by night. Vultures wheel above, searching for carrion. Coyotes roam the dunes, their howls tearing through midnight silence. Here, evidence does not linger. The wind scatters footprints. The sun bleaches bones. Time swallows memory. For detectives in 1994, this was the nightmare. A missing couple, no ransom demand, no witnesses, no clues, only the unforgiving expanse of desert. The Mexican authorities, working alongside the FBI, launched an intensive search in the weeks following Ethan and Alice's disappearance. Detective Javier Ruiz, a grizzled investigator from Chihuahua City, headed the case. Ruiz had seen his share of border crimes, cartel killings, drug smuggling, migrants lost in the wilderness, but this case disturbed him deeply. A pregnant woman vanishing into thin air? It gnawed at him. He reviewed every scrap of evidence: the abandoned Explorer, the sketch pad with its tender drawings, the ultrasound photo taped to the first page. He returned again and again to the half-eaten picnic. Why leave food uneaten? Why walk away from shelter in such a dangerous place? He spoke to locals in the village of Llanos, where Alice and Ethan had planned to stay. The innkeeper, Rosa, repeated her memory of the couple. Her voice trembled as she recalled Alice's glowing smile, her hand rubbing her belly as if to reassure the child inside. Ethan, calm and protective, joked with Rosa's grandson about being an old man with a baby on the way. But after check-in, the trail vanished. No strangers reported, no thefts, no violence, nothing. Alice's family offered one troubling detail. Years before, in her late 30s, Alice had been trapped in a toxic relationship with a man named Raymond Torres. A mechanic from El Paso, Torres had a reputation for violence. He drank heavily, fought often, and when Alice ended the relationship, his obsession turned dark. He stalked her, appearing at her workplace, sending her unhinged letters filled with rage and longing. At one point, he carved her name into the hood of her car. A restraining order eventually forced him to back away, and over time, he seemed to vanish. Rumors swirled. He had been involved in a bar fight, perhaps fled south of the border, but there were no records, no sightings. He became a ghost.
As forensic teams analyzed the cables and the blouse, a new lead emerged. In Juarez prison, a convicted felon, once a drinking companion of Raymond Torres, claimed he had heard Torres brag years earlier. The words were chilling. "I left a gringa to the spines. Let the desert judge her." Suddenly, the ghost from Alice's past stepped out of the shadows. Was Raymond Torres, the violent ex-boyfriend she had once fled, behind her death? And if so, what had become of Ethan Morrison?
Detective Ruiz flagged Torres in his notes, but without evidence, it was a shadow lead. Alice had moved on, built a new life, and there was no trace connecting Torres to Chihuahua in 1994. Still, the possibility lingered. Meanwhile, the Morrison family refused to give up. Ethan's brother Marcus became the face of the search. He distributed flyers in Phoenix, El Paso, Tucson, even as far as Albuquerque. Local news ran his desperate pleas. My brother wouldn't just walk away from his family. And that baby? God, that baby deserves a chance at life. The community rallied. But as weeks became months, public attention drifted elsewhere. Other tragedies, other headlines. For most, the couple became just another unsolved mystery in the desert. By the end of 1995, the official investigation slowed to a crawl. Ruiz, exhausted and under pressure from cartel cases, had little left to pursue. His files, photos of the explorer, transcripts of interviews, Alice's smiling face, were tucked into a cardboard box, shoved into a dusty archive. For the families, the silence was unbearable. Every holiday, every birthday, Alice and Ethan's absence screamed louder. Laura, Alice's sister, had a daughter in 1998 and named her Lily in tribute to the child Alice never had. But it was a bittersweet act, a reminder of what had been stolen.
For 13 years, the Morrison and Patterson families lived with silence. No bodies, no graves, just questions gnawing like jackals in the dark. Then, in October 2007, the desert finally answered. It began with a group of German backpackers, 4 friends who had come to northern Mexico for photography, stargazing, and solitude. They set up camp near Puerto Palomas, a remote village where the desert seems endless, rolling out in waves of sand, thorns, and stone. The night sky was an ocean of stars, dazzling in its emptiness. The next morning, under a sun already cruel by 9 a.m., they wandered off the main trail in search of striking landscapes. Klaus, the group's leader, carried a camera with a wide-angle lens. He wanted cactus silhouettes against the horizon. They moved toward a stand of giant cardon cacti, massive spiny towers reaching 30 feet high, their thick green arms etched with decades of desert life. The group laughed, crunching over brittle ocotillo branches, when suddenly, Klaus stopped. His breath caught. At the base of one cactus, something unnatural gleamed in the sand. He stepped closer, then froze. It was a skeleton. Lashed upright against the massive cactus trunk with rusted electrical cables, the body had long since decomposed. The desert had stripped the flesh away, leaving only brittle, yellowed bones. But the horror was more than death itself. The cactus had grown around the body. Over the years, its long spines, some as thick as fingers, had pierced through ribs, spine, and limbs, weaving the remains into its own flesh. The skull lolled forward, empty sockets gazing eternally at the horizon. The ribcage was split by dozens of thorns. It looked less like a body left in the desert and more like the desert itself had claimed a victim, fusing human and plant into one grotesque sculpture. At the skeleton's feet, half buried in red sand, lay scraps of fabric. Klaus knelt, his hands trembling. He pulled a fragment free. It was a blouse, pink, cracked with age, stiffened with what looked like dark, dried blood. Along its collar was a faint embroidery of wildflowers. Klaus staggered back, retching into the dust. His companions, pale and shaking, fumbled for their satellite phone. Mexican federales arrived within hours. Yellow tape fluttered in the desert wind as forensic teams in ghostly white suits swarmed the site. They cut away cables and carefully lifted the remains from the cactus, laying them onto a black body bag that seemed obscenely small against the desert's vastness.
In Chihuahua City, dental records and DNA analysis confirmed what the families had long feared. The skeleton was Alice Patterson. The pink blouse matched descriptions her family had given back in 1994, the same one she wore when she left for Mexico, packed carefully for her celebration trip. Its fabric, stiff with blood, told of violence. But the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Where was Ethan? Where was the baby? Alice had been pregnant when she vanished, yet among the bones, there were no fetal remains. Forensic specialists explained that after so many years, with the desert's brutal cycles of heat, cold, and scavengers, any tiny fetal bones might have disintegrated or been carried away. To Alice's family, it was a second death. The unborn Lily lost forever, erased by time. Investigators scoured the cactus site. They found no footprints, no shell casings, no personal belongings beyond the blouse. But they did find something chilling: the electrical cables binding the skeleton. Experts traced the cables to industrial spools common in factories near the US-Mexico border, especially in El Paso. This was no natural death, no accident. Alice had been bound, intentionally left to suffer against the cactus. Detective Ruiz, now gray-haired and near retirement, returned to the case he once believed unsolvable. Standing over the photos of the cactus-bound skeleton, he whispered, "This was no disappearance. This was execution." Word of the discovery spread fast. News outlets across Mexico and the US ran headlines. Skeleton found lashed to desert cactus. Pregnant woman identified after 13 years. In Phoenix, Marcus Morrison received the call he had both dreaded and prayed for. He flew to Chihuahua immediately. In the sterile light of a morgue, he was shown the crime scene photographs. His fists clenched until his knuckles went white. Tears blurred his eyes, but his voice was steady when he asked, "Who does this to a pregnant woman? Who leaves her like that?" Detective Ruiz promised him the case would not go cold again. Forensics dated the death to late March 1994, aligning perfectly with the couple's disappearance. That meant Alice had died almost immediately after vanishing. She had suffered, but she had not been wandering for years. Still, the central question remained: if Alice was found, where was Ethan?
The discovery of Alice Patterson's skeleton in 2007 sent shockwaves through Chihuahua's law enforcement. Forensic confirmation ended 13 years of silence, but it also opened a door into darkness. Someone had bound her to that cactus. Someone had watched her suffer, left her to die. That kind of cruelty had a name. Detective Javier Ruiz, older now, his mustache flecked with gray, retrieved the old case file from storage. Dust clung to the cardboard box, but inside were memories that had haunted him since 1994. Alice's photos smiling in her pink blouse, Ethan's careful handwriting on hotel reservation slips, notes about their last phone call. And buried among the pages was a name Ruiz had underlined more than once but could never prove: Raymond Torres. Torres had been a volatile presence in Alice's life years earlier. Born in El Paso, he worked as a mechanic, known for his temper and his fists. Neighbors remembered the shouting matches, the slammed doors, the long nights when Alice would cry quietly in her car before finally leaving him. When she walked away, his obsession twisted into something darker. Court records showed a restraining order filed against him after he stalked her, sending letters that rambled between pleas of love and threats of violence. The last reported sighting of Torres was in 1993, when he fled after a brutal bar fight. Some said he'd gone south, others claimed he was dead, but no records surfaced. By 1994, he had become a ghost. And now, with Alice's body found in Mexico, tied with cables traced to border factories, that ghost had stepped back into view.
Ruiz knew the desert did not lie. The cables weren't random. They were industrial, used in El Paso assembly plants and construction sites. Investigators pulled samples from factories and compared the metal composition. The match was clear. The type of cable was identical to those found in scrapyards near the border. It was a lead, but still circumstantial. The real breakthrough came from a prison cell. In Juarez, a former associate of Torres, a man serving time for armed robbery, told investigators he remembered drinking with Torres years earlier. Over tequila shots, Torres had spoken cryptically about a woman. He said he left her to the spines, that she betrayed him and the desert would decide her fate. The phrase, "to the spines," was chilling. It was no coincidence.
Interpol and U.S. authorities joined in, tracking the phantom of Raymond Torres. They discovered he had been living under an alias, Ricardo Valdez, a quiet ranch hand in a small hamlet outside Delicias, Mexico. On paper, he was harmless, tending goats, trading at the local market, living alone in a crumbling adobe shack. But neighbors whispered about him. They said he kept to himself, muttering angrily under his breath. At night, he carved strange shapes into wooden posts. One rancher swore he saw Torres burn letters in a barrel, staring into the flames as if communing with something only he could see. When investigators raided his home, what they found erased all doubt. Inside the shack were yellowed newspaper clippings of Alice and Ethan's disappearance from 1994, pages torn from American magazines mentioning missing persons cases, and scribbled in a notebook were words that made Ruiz's stomach turn. Mine forever. She carried his seed. The desert will cleanse. Torres was arrested on the spot. Shackled and dragged into interrogation under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, he sat defiant, his face weathered leather, his eyes still burning with the madness of obsession. For hours he denied everything. Then the facade cracked. "You don't understand," he hissed in Spanish, slamming his fist on the table. "She was mine. She betrayed me with him, carrying his seed like some curse." His voice grew louder, his accent thickening. The desert judged her. The spines took her sin. The confession spilled out in fragments, hours of tape capturing his unraveling psyche. He admitted to tailing Ethan and Alice on their trip, watching them check into the inn, following them into the desert. He waited until they were alone, then struck. The details were horrifying. As Ethan and Alice stood near their car, sketching the sunset, Torres emerged from the scrub, a tire iron to Ethan's skull, a chloroform rag pressed to Alice's face. He dragged them to a derelict miner's shack he had prepared in advance. Ethan woke bound to a chair. Torres beat him, demanding to know if the unborn child was his, a delusion fueled by jealousy and rage. When Ethan spat defiance, Torres pressed a revolver to his temple and pulled the trigger. One echo in the desert, then silence. He buried Ethan miles away, beneath a pile of rocks, marking the spot with an old canteen. Alice, still alive, became his prisoner. The confession was a bombshell, but Ruiz knew words were not enough. They needed proof. Guided by Torres's own directions, search teams fanned out into the desert. Days later, they uncovered a shallow grave, bones gnawed by scavengers, a gold wedding band engraved with the words E&A forever. Ethan Morrison was finally found. The desert had hidden him for 13 years, and now it surrendered him back to his family. Back in Phoenix, Marcus Morrison received the news with a hollow mix of grief and relief. His brother's body was no longer lost, but the reality of his final moments cut deep. He'd tried to protect her, he whispered,
staring at the wedding band returned to him by investigators, and he died for it. The case that had gathered dust for over a decade was now alive, blazing with evidence. But the most horrifying part was yet to be revealed, because Alice had not died quickly. Torres's confession painted a picture of captivity, torment, and ritual, and investigators would soon learn just how twisted his obsession had become in the desert's lonely silence. Raymond Torres was no longer a ghost. He was flesh and blood, shackled and raging. But his confession hinted at horrors far worse than a simple killing. Alice Patterson's final days would soon come to light, and they would haunt everyone who heard them.
Raymond Torres was not a man who forgot. When Alice Patterson walked out of his life in the early 1990s, she closed a chapter he refused to end. To Alice, he was a memory she buried, volatile, jealous, violent. To Torres, she was an unfinished story. And in his twisted mind, unfinished stories demanded closure. After the breakup, he drifted south, hiding from warrants in El Paso after a bar fight that left another man bloodied on the floor. In Mexico, he reinvented himself as Ricardo Valdez, taking odd jobs, ranch hand, mechanic, day laborer. But he carried Alice with him like a shadow. Neighbors would later tell investigators they sometimes heard him muttering her name while sharpening knives, or saw him staring into the fire as he burned letters. He nursed his bitterness in solitude, stewing over the life she had denied him. Through mutual acquaintances, Torres learned fragments of her new life, that she was teaching art, that she had found love with an older man named Ethan Morrison, and worst of all, at least in his mind, that she was pregnant. Pregnancy. To Torres, it was the final betrayal, another man's child, proof that she had moved on, chosen someone else's embrace, someone else's seed. It consumed him. In late February 1994, weeks before Ethan and Alice's trip, Torres began preparing. He crossed the border, stealing an old pickup from a lot in Tucson. He stocked it with supplies, electrical cables scavenged from a construction site, a tire iron, a pistol, and chloroform. But his preparations weren't purely practical. They were symbolic. He scrawled words on the inside of his shack's walls, quote, "Mine forever," unquote. He carved Alice's initials into the wood alongside his own, as though branding the space for their reunion. The desert was not just his hiding place, it was his chosen stage. To him, the desert was judgment, endless, merciless, ancient. If Alice would not stay by his side in life, then he would bind her to its sands in death.
On March 15, 1994, Torres trailed them from Tucson, his stolen pickup rumbling far behind the Explorer. He kept his distance, stopping when they stopped, shadowing their route. When Ethan called his brother that afternoon, Torres was close enough to see the silver-haired man laughing into the phone, close enough to watch Alice sketch a flower. To him, it was mockery. She was radiant, pregnant, glowing. But not for him. He waited until twilight. When they pulled off the trail near their car, he moved. Emerging from the scrub with a tire iron, he struck Ethan hard across the skull. Alice screamed, but the chloroform rag silenced her. By the time stars burned over the desert sky, Ethan and Alice were bound in the shack. The interrogation tapes would later reveal Torres's delusions. He demanded Alice admit the child was his. He raged when she denied it. He beat Ethan, pistol whipping him until blood streamed down his temple. Still, Ethan defied him, telling him Alice would never be his, that the baby was theirs alone. That defiance cost Ethan his life. A single gunshot ended him, his body later buried under rocks 20 miles away. Alice's ordeal, however, was just beginning.
Torres alternated between cruelty and tenderness, a grotesque pendulum. One moment he wept, stroking Alice's hair, feeding her scraps of dried meat. The next, he lashed her with his belt, cutting shallow wounds across her arms and torso. He whispered that the child would be his, that the desert would bless them. Alice begged. She cried for Ethan, for her sister, for her unborn daughter. But Torres heard only betrayal in her words. Days blurred together. The shack reeked of sweat, blood, and obsession. Alice grew weaker, lips cracked from dehydration, her blouse torn and stained, and still Torres raved. In his madness, Torres remembered an old story he once heard from Yaqui tribesmen, a tale of desert penance, of thorns cleansing sin. The legend twisted in his fevered mind. "The spines will cleanse you," he whispered to Alice, his eyes wild. "The desert will judge." One evening, as the sun bled orange over the horizon, he dragged her from the shack. Stumbling, delirious, she cried out for mercy. He marched her to the towering cardone cactus he had chosen. There, with the industrial cables, he lashed her wrists and ankles to the trunk. The cactus's spines pierced her back, her sides, her arms. She screamed as the needles tore through her skin, drawing fresh blood. Torres left a single canteen of foul water at her feet. "Enough to think about what you've done," he hissed. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her bound, her body impaled by living thorns, as the desert swallowed her cries. For hours, perhaps days, Alice suffered. The cactus did not release her. Coyotes circled at a distance. The sun blistered her skin by day, the cold gnawed her bones by night.
The human body is resilient, but it was never built for the Chihuahua Desert. The heat scorches, the nights freeze, and the air itself feels like punishment. In that hostile landscape, Alice Patterson endured her final days. From the interrogation tapes, pieced together with forensic evidence, investigators reconstructed the horror. Torres had not killed her quickly. He wanted her to suffer, to bear the full weight of what he called her betrayal. At first, he kept her chained to the iron bed frame in the shack. Her wrists blistered under the cuffs. She begged for water, for mercy, for Ethan. But Torres oscillated between tenderness and cruelty. One moment, he pressed a cup of stale water to her lips, whispering, "You're mine again, Alice." The next, he lashed her with his belt, leaving shallow cuts across her arms. The pink blouse she had once worn with joy became soaked with sweat, blood, and dirt. Torres's madness was fueled by obsession. In the tapes, he raved about their past, about how she had left him, how she had chosen wrong. He demanded she admit the child she carried was his. Alice, delirious and weak, denied it. She repeated Ethan's name like a prayer. Each denial pushed Torres deeper into rage. He struck her, screamed at her, then crumbled into sobs at her feet. "You don't understand. I loved you first. You were supposed to be mine." By the third day, Alice was too weak to resist. Her lips cracked, her voice little more than whispers. She clutched her stomach, praying silently for her unborn daughter. But Torres had already chosen her fate. He spoke of an old desert legend, a tale twisted by his fevered mind. He believed the cactus would cleanse her sins, that the thorns would purify her betrayal. So he dragged her into the blazing sun. The cactus stood like a sentinel in the sand, its thick trunk bristling with spines. Torres bound her wrists and ankles with the industrial cables, forcing her against the cactus's flesh. The spines pierced her immediately, through her back, her arms, her sides. Each thorn drove agony into her body. She screamed until her voice broke.
the sound echoing into the emptiness. No one heard. No one came. Only coyotes stirred at the edges of the scrub. Torres left a single canteen of brackish water at her feet, enough to prolong life, not enough to save it. Then he walked away. For hours, perhaps even days, Alice remained bound. The sun blistered her skin by day, cold winds tore at her body by night. She tried to move, to struggle, but every motion only drove the cactus spines deeper. Blood trickled, dried, and crusted along her blouse. Dehydration set in quickly. Her throat cracked, her thoughts blurred. She whispered Ethan's name, her sister's, her unborn child's. She prayed, her voice faint, her hope flickering like a candle in the wind. At some point, exhaustion overcame pain. Her head slumped forward, her body surrendering. The desert claimed her, slowly and without mercy.
When investigators studied the remains 13 years later, they saw how completely the cactus had claimed her. The spines had grown through ribs and vertebrae, locking her skeleton into the plant's flesh. It was as if the desert itself had taken her, refusing to release the truth until 2007. Forensic experts concluded she had likely survived no more than 2 or 3 days after being tied to the cactus. A slow death, a cruel death. For Alice's family, learning these details was unbearable. Laura, her sister, broke down when detectives described the cactus bindings. She deserved joy, she sobbed. She deserved to hold her baby. Not that. Marcus Morrison, Ethan's brother, clenched his fists as he listened to the tapes of Thoris's confession. He imagined his brother's wife, pregnant, innocent, left to die alone. It wasn't just murder, he said. It was torture. It was evil. The case shocked the public. Newspapers in Mexico and the U.S. carried headlines about the cactus-bound woman. Television crews called it one of the most sadistic crimes ever uncovered in the region. In Phoenix, Alice and Ethan's story resurfaced. Old neighbors spoke of their kindness, their joy at the pregnancy. Friends lit candles, held vigils. People who had forgotten their names now remembered with horror. The desert's silence was broken, and the world demanded justice. Torres sat in custody, his face unrepentant. He ranted about love, about betrayal, about destiny, but the evidence was undeniable. His confession matched the physical proof: the cables, the cactus, the blouse, and the grave where Ethan's bones were found with his wedding band still intact. The prosecutor knew they had enough for conviction, but they also knew this case was more than legal. It was symbolic. It was about showing that even in the silence of the desert, justice could still be found. Alice's final days were brutal, but they would not be forgotten. The cactus that once held her would become a grim landmark in the investigation. Photographs of its spines piercing human bones were entered into evidence. The pink blouse was sealed in an evidence locker, its embroidery of flowers still faintly visible beneath bloodstains. For Detective Ruiz, it was both vindication and torment. He had carried the case for 13 years, believing it unsolvable. Now he had answers, but answers drenched in cruelty. Sometimes he said quietly to a reporter, "Truth is worse than not knowing." The world now knew how Alice Patterson had died, bound, broken, left to the thorns. But one question remained. Would the law be enough to punish Raymond Torres, a man who claimed the desert itself had been his accomplice?
By late 2007, the case of Ethan Morrison and Alice Patterson was no longer a cold file buried in the archives of Chihuahua. It was alive again, burning in headlines, dissected on television, whispered about in towns on both sides of the border. The question was no longer what happened. That horror was clear. The question was now, would Raymond Torres, the man who confessed to it all, finally face justice?
Ruiz and the prosecutors knew that confessions alone could be challenged in court. They needed physical proof, evidence that corroborated Torres's words. So they pushed him for more details.
Torres eventually broke not out of remorse, but out of pride. He wanted them to know how clever he had been, how thoroughly he had planned. He told them where Ethan's body lay. Guided by Torres's instructions, search teams drove deep into the desert. They stopped at a cluster of rocks marked by a rusted canteen. Beneath the cairn lay bones, weathered and scattered by scavengers, but still identifiable. Among them was a wedding band, gold dulled by years of sand, engraved with 3 simple words: E and A forever. DNA confirmed it was Ethan Morrison. The discovery solidified the case. 2 victims, 2 sites, 1 perpetrator. With both victims accounted for, prosecutors prepared for trial. The charges were staggering: double homicide, kidnapping, rape, torture, desecration of a corpse. The case would be tried in Chihuahua City, and it drew enormous media attention. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, their cameras flashing as Torres was led inside in shackles. To some, he looked like a broken old man. To others, he was the embodiment of evil. In court, prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. The DNA confirming Alice's remains, the forensic match of the blouse she wore, the cables traced to border factories, the grave containing Ethan's bones and his engraved ring. The confession tapes played in chilling detail. Jurors sat stone-faced as they listened to Torres describe his so-called desert judgment, his voice chilling in its calmness.
She screamed, he admitted at one point on the tape. The coyotes answered. No one else. Torres's defense tried to argue insanity. They claimed he was delusional, driven by hallucinations, incapable of knowing right from wrong. But the jury was unconvinced. His careful preparations, the stolen truck, the shack, the cables, spoke not of madness, but of intent. Detective Ruiz testified as well, his voice steady despite the weight of years. He told the jury about the dusty box of files he had reopened, about the pain of Alice's family, about the brutality of the cactus bindings. This was not justice, Ruiz said firmly. This was cruelty. This was possession masquerading as love. The trial lasted weeks, but the verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Raymond Torres, known by his false name Ricardo Valdez, to life in Puente Grande prison, one of Mexico's most notorious facilities. It was a sentence that meant he would die behind bars. For Marcus Morrison and Laura Patterson, the verdict was both vindication and agony. They had fought for years to keep the memory of their loved ones alive. Now they had justice, but justice could not bring Ethan and Alice back. Marcus later told reporters, "The desert took 13 years to tell the truth, and when it did, it cut us deeper than we thought possible. But at least we know. At least we can bury them." Torres was transferred to Puente Grande under heavy guard. Inside the prison's towering walls, whispers spread quickly. Inmates murmured about the man who tied a pregnant woman to a cactus, about the monster who called it love. In a place where even hardened criminals feared judgment, Torres's crimes stood apart. Some say the guards turned a blind eye to what happened next. Others insist it's only rumor. But Torres's years in prison were marked by isolation, violence, and the slow erosion of a man once consumed by obsession.
For the world, the case became a chilling reminder of obsession's power to destroy. Documentaries aired, true crime shows dissected the details, writers described the image of a skeleton lashed to a cactus as one of the most grotesque crime scenes ever uncovered. Yet beyond the headlines, the story was about more than cruelty.
It was about a family torn apart, about lives cut short, about how love meant to celebrate new beginnings ended in unimaginable horror. The desert itself remains indifferent. It swallows footprints, it erases traces, it holds secrets in silence until, at its own pace, it decides to release them. For 13 years, it held Ethan and Alice's story. When it finally spoke, the truth was crueler than anyone could have imagined. At the gravesite in Phoenix, Marcus often sits in silence, his hands folded over his brother's headstone. To him, justice was necessary, but it was not enough. "I don't come here for closure," he said once. "I come here to remember, to make sure their story isn't forgotten." For Laura, it is the same. Every time I see a cactus, I think of her. I think of how much she loved flowers. She should have been painting them, not dying among them. The desert took Ethan Morrison and Alice Patterson. It buried their unborn child. It forced their families to endure 13 years of silence. But the desert could not bury truth forever. And though truth cut deep, it grew into something else, a legacy, a foundation, a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, love and memory endure.
If stories like this move you, and you want more real-life cases that reveal the truth behind the headlines, make sure you hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss the next powerful story we bring to life.